Welcome back once again to the DANCNG SOBR podcast. Please go down on that little red button right here on YouTube and hit subscribe. It's really important to this channel. And if you're on the audio platforms, please rate and comment. This week we have a small business shout out to Tonali Studios. Tonali Studios is art gallery, little store out in East Los Angeles. So they like to call themselves a place of creative wellness. They have meditation classes. They have an art exhibit that opens this weekend called Amor Eterno, a group exhibit. And they have something that they call a karma clinic where you can go and talk to somebody. And there's also a chiropractor there that day, I think. And it's a pay what you can kind of service. So Tonali Studios, here is their Instagram. I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Movita Juice Bar. Don't forget to go to movitajuicebar.com to look for their locations or order through your food apps. And a big shout out to the people here at Outer Circle Media. Today's guest is definitely a special one, and I really appreciate that. She took the time to come out here and sit with me and talk for a while. Today's guest is Ofelia Esparza. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, welcome back once again to the DANCNG SOBR podcast. And today we have probably, arguably, one of the most loved artists of East Los Angeles and of California maybe. Ofelia Esparza is in the house.
Thank you.
How are you?
I am fine. Thank you.
Before we start anything, I want to say something to you.
Okay.
Estas son las mañanitas que cantaba el rey David.
Oh,
Sorry, everybody, for my singing. A las muchachas bonitas se las cantamos así.
Gracias.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Wow.
We can have it after.
Yes. And you know, I have to tell you something. I think you know it already, that you're one of my mijos.
No.
Rosana says she has a list of mijos,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
do. These people that I've just met, several years ago,
Yeah.
and just you're like my mijo. I love you.
Thank you so much. We love you too. And it's funny because we don't see each other often, but when we do, it's always like that connection.
Yes.
It's always like
Yes.
family. It's always like right away we start to laugh and
Yes.
joke. And yeah, it's beautiful. Thank you.
Yes.
So I can call you my nana then?
Yes,
Yeah.
you could.
Okay.
You could.
Okay. I remember you told that to me and Dewey once.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
you told us.
Well, he's one of them too, of
Yeah,
course. The list has grown not too much, but I have several dear friends that I like my sons.
Yeah, well, back in, when I started hanging around self-help graphics, it was, different. It was like everybody just walks in and out at
Yes.
any time. And so there was that. It really was like an open door family vibe kind of thing.
It's always been a very special place,
Yeah.
and now even more
Yeah.
part of our histories in a way.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge part of East Los Angeles, California, Chicano history. So let's just go back a little bit. I usually like to start by, first greeting my guests, saying hello, welcome. Estás en tu casa. Right here we speak both Spanish and English. You could switch codes anytime you want. And I like to start by asking people the simplest questions of like, where were you born and where did you grow up? Just tell us some stories.
Well, I was born in East Los Angeles, and I live about 4 blocks from the place where I was born. I was born in a home in my neighborhood in 1932, so I'm going to be 90 on Saturday. Gosh.
That's a beautiful number. That's a beautiful, beautiful number.
Yeah. Although I tell my kids, for many years, I see the world through 17-year-old eyes. There's still that child wonder part of me that's always been there.
And at 90, still, you're always active, always moving, always building, always,
Yes,
doing
I
things.
am.
Were you like that when you were little, growing up in East LA? Like, what areas did you hang out in? City
Well,
Terrace Park. I know you lived
no, I was, the
Obregon Park.
the people that it was called. It still is, but I hopefully not in the way things have turned into some of the neighborhoods. It was called El Hoyo
Oh yeah,
because
El
it
Hoyo.
went down the street from. It was called Brooklyn Avenue, and then the little street that goes straight down, and then it goes up again, and that's where today it's Obregon Park. But I was born on Carmelita and First Street, and now I live on. Well, I live up the street, up the hill a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's only like 4 blocks away.
Yeah.
And that's where I hung out until I went to school. I went to school at Hamel Street School across the Cesar Chavez. When I talk about the past, I'll always say Brooklyn Avenue.
That's fine.
It's a point of
Yeah. Most of the people that watch this know that Cesar Chavez was once Brooklyn Avenue. Yeah. Yeah.
but and it was, and then my teen years, I in the same street up half a block, but it was an alley part of the street, and I grew up there the rest of to my adult life, even after I got married. And then I moved to where I live now, another block away, 2 blocks away.
When you were little, did you have a big family? A lot of brothers and sisters?
Yeah, we were 6, and we lived in an adobe house on San Carlos Street. Was the last.
Wow.
Well, it became the last adobe house, but next door was an adobe structure. It was a 2-story, abandoned or vacated, like a salon. And as a child, I just knew it was empty, and it was a place that we explored.
Yeah, of
and
course.
it wasn't boarded up, but it was an adobe 2-story space. And I love to think of, there was a wedding one time in my block, and the family went in there and cleaned it up and put soap suds on the floor to polish it, and we had the wedding there. I remember
Wow.
dancing there. and
Abandoned adobe, and you gave that a party.
and the groom lived across the street, and the bride lived 2 houses away from us. So all the neighborhood came, their families, and I even danced with the groom, and he was trailing me, and then it was so slippery, I slipped and I fell, and then he picked me up and took me back to my mother. I
that's
might
hilarious.
have been about 6 years old, but I love those memories. But it was an adobe house, and where I lived was also an adobe house, a duplex, and many great memories, especially of my brother.
Yeah. And you went to Hamel and then Belvedere, I
Belvedere
imagine,
Junior High School.
which is now directly in front of where
Yeah,
you
that's
live
right.
now. And so
And it's so sad,
it's changing right now, yeah.
they're demolishing building by building, and it really hurt. It really felt a great loss. Of course, the great loss was on the day that my sister died. They started cutting down the trees. They started with the trees, those tall eucalyptus trees that where lots of birds, especially ravens, gather. And it was very significant, and that's the day I learned my sister died 2 years ago. And so Rosanna and I got up early the morning just before they started cutting. The equipment was just getting there, and we did ceremony. We blessed it and sang and cried, and it was bad. It was sad, but that's what happened.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, these things are sad.
Yeah.
Where did your connection to spirituality begin, if you can
I think
remember?
it was always my mother. Although my mother wasn't like a soft-spoken, she was strong. I call her a warrior woman, guerrera. She could do everything. She was raised by her great grandmother, Hipólita Tinoco, who has been part of my pantheon of heroes and women. But I always have talked about her because that's what my mother did. I never met her. I thought I never met her. But I felt so close to her through my mother's stories. My mother never stopped talking about her. And everything my mother did my mother was a great cook. And she cooked in a style that I didn't know anyone else did except my aunts who were born from the same town in Guanímaro, Guanajuato, but it's right on the border of Michoacán. And they had just very unique cuisine. And the one that I've never tasted again that I dream about is tamales de ceniza. And I went back to her town twice in the last 15 years. And I didn't find anyone who was making them like her.
What did they add to it, or how did they make it different?
Well,
ceniza,
to make them, many people, she would make them from scratch. She would buy the hard nixtamal. It's really hard shelled corn. In fact, it was some of it was bluish. And then we had a big tina, a big metal tub outside. It was an open fire.
Where you soaked it.
Yeah. And it would be, and then she would put, she and my dad or other paisanos who would come over for tamales, that was very special. And they would burn leña de ¿cómo se llama?
Mezquite?
Mesquite. And the ashes were put into the water and boiling, and then the nixtamal, and then they stirred till it was soft enough, and then they would drain it, and my mother would ground it in the metate, and she had a huge metate, real heavy. And the traditional way for nixtamal is to put lime in it, because the shell is so hard, so when they boil it in the lime, it softens the casing on it, and then it's ready to be, it could be ground, with a metate, or how, in the stores, the tortillerias, they use a molino, electric one. But that taste that you got, well, first of all, then she did the masa on the metate, and it was hard work. I don't ever remember anyone ever helping her. Maybe once, maybe my aunt, or I don't know if it was my aunt, but another. But my mother did. It was hard work, and then she would, scrape that with her hand, and then put it in a bowl, and then my aunt or somebody else would take the bowl and put another one. Then when it was ready I would love to watch, and my mother would let me, embarrar la hoja, but she used the leaves from a fresh corn plant, and they would cut it to the widest part, and they would be about maybe 2 feet long, and they were from her garden. She had corn, squash, tomatoes. I can't remember what else. Calabazas, yeah. And so then once they spread the masa on that section of corned beef, then they would start folding it over like a little booklet. And then they would tie it, and then they would cook it in a steamer like all traditionally, like all tamales. And when we'd eat them the next morning, that's how I remember, my dad would make a huge pot of chile with very loose, very soupy caldillo. It was chile güerito and other chiles. And then they would make 2 eggs, frijoles de la olla, and that tamal, and then the chile over it. Oh, and when you unfolded the tamal, it was yellowish, greenish yellow from the leaf. It was no meat, it was just the masa, and it was the most distinct. I could still taste it when I think of it. And it was like using it as a bread. You could use it, with other things, but I remember the egg and the frijoles de la olla. Oh, and piece of cheese on the side too.
Queso fresco.
Queso fresco. So what a meal. My brother would say, this is the food of the gods.
Yeah.
They always talk like that about our roots. That's very interesting. So
Since
I
you
grew
were
up
young,
this kind of way. And I've yearned for that. But I see it, and I see the process, and I even taste it.
So are you saying that Liliana's doesn't have the same flavor?
No.
They do a good,
Yeah, they have a
Elote
variety.
tamal, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's another
But
one.
yeah.
My mother made several other
Yeah,
kinds,
of
but that one
course.
was so special because of the preparation.
The
for it.
ash too, right?
And my
that's
aunts would
interesting.
come because they were from the same town, and
Yeah.
that's so her mama Pola is the one who taught her, my mother, and then she made other tamales. She made some that was just masa or the shucked corn, and that was a side, but always for the frijoles de loya and chile. So basic and so nutritious, and so healthy.
After Belvedere, did you go to Garfield or Roosevelt or anything?
Yeah, Garfield. I went to Belvedere, Garfield, and I graduated in 1950.
1950.
At that time, Garfield had a couple of bungalows that were housing the beginning of East LA College. They were building East LA College, and by the time I think
Those
by
World War
1950,
II barracks that they brought in,
yes,
right? Yeah,
and then
they're not there anymore, but
no.
that used to be the
But
little theater.
before it was East LA College, when I was growing up, I didn't venture far because I was a little girl, but my brother went all over the hills and all that. But when we go by there, it was flower field, Japanese flower
Oh wow.
fields, the whole area, because
Yeah.
Monterey,
Yeah, from the
hills in the
Floral
back.
Drive-In all the way
yeah,
to
all
that
those
side.
are
it was all-
hills, all the way to Alhambra.
Yeah.
and many of those hills were agriculture. The ones close to Brooklyn Avenue, where East LA College is, and the housing above it, Monterey Park Hills, I think they call it. All that was Japanese owned flower fields, and then beyond that, up on where the Long Beach Freeway is, where the Biscaloo Center is up on the hill between City Terrace and what is now what is it?
The 710?
Metnick, I guess.
Oh yeah.
Those hills were other things. Wheat, even up to 1948.
Wheat. Wow.
Or hay, because I would see the bundles.
Yeah.
The hill was green when it was being, and then in the harvest time they were all just brown, but you see the bundles of
The hay.
hay or standing up like that. They were typed before they were taken away, but the harvest were there. It was even like that in 1948 when I was a junior at Garfield, and the year that it snowed in 1948, I from my house, because we were up on a little hill on San Carlos Street, you could see the bundles. It was snow.
covered in
It only
snow.
lasted a couple of days, but it was a beautiful sight.
Historic day in East LA when it snowed.
Well, East LA has been, I love my neighborhood.
Yeah.
So rich with people and customs and music and beautiful.
And someone like you knows all the little nooks and crannies and all the little tiny, flavors of it that maybe somebody that doesn't know the neighborhood will just like pass through and not even get a hint of it.
When I went to Belvedere in 1944. The war was already on, World War II, and I was in Belvedere in 1945 when it ended. I was walking home from school, and you could start hearing lots of horns blowing, and I kind of stopped, and somebody says, "The war! It's the end of the war," and I went home, and it was significant because my brother went to war. He was 18 when he left. He was wounded in Germany or Belgium, I believe, but he was in a hospital in Germany or somewhere between Germany and Belgium, and so it was wonderful to have him come home.
I'm a little curious to know if like in the 50s if you were like listening to Elvis.
In the 50s, I got married in 1951. I started having I was busy I have 9 children.
Yes, I was gonna get to that.
And so all that, I was, my era from when I was 13 or so was the swing area. So Glenn Miller and all the black music.
Big bands.
That was what we danced to. And in our neighborhood at Belvedere, one of my classmates was Manuel Armenta, and he was his family, his older brother. They had the Armenta Brothers band, and they played all the, not only the swing and but Mexican music, and their version of swing, and always had this. So we danced a lot. I love to dance.
I could imagine. Back in those days, were you going to the Paramount Ballroom?
I went only for 2 weddings. My mother was pretty strict, and it wasn't till I was till I was a teenager, like almost 17, and still at Garfield, that I think after I graduated, one of my girlfriends got married and had her wedding there. We went there. But I didn't go too many dances after I got married. I was too busy being a mother, and without my mother, I couldn't have done it. I don't know. It was just so. But I always lived next door to my mother. She had a property up on that hill. That's where I lived for most of my married life.
That's perfect when you have the family around you like that.
Yes, always.
When you graduated high school, did you meet your husband in high school, or?
I met him when I was a kid. He was my neighbor. His family lived on Brooklyn Avenue in the back house. He was the oldest of 14 children.
Wow.
And what I knew of
I
him...
wish I could have 14 children right now. That's a good size.
We were so poor. But they used to go to the Piscas, up north to Hanford, and what was the other one? We passed by.
Cherries and cebollas and...
I think the apricots was one of them, and those were the big ones that I remember.
Walnuts.
Yeah. And almonds, I believe.
Almonds, yeah, that's a lot up there. Central Valley.
And so his dad would take the family up there in the summers, right at the beginning of summers, and my husband would go he was the oldest, so he was the guy who did the heaviest work. His dad would come back to LA because he had a job here. So his family, my husband's dad's family, Esparzas, they lived on First and Mariana Street, right near in the neighborhood. They were house movers. They were big. There was about 10 of them, Esparzas. So I married the grandson of one of them, and they were kind of, I don't know if I should say all the family secrets, but everybody knew. They were notorious for the way they celebrated.
Oh, okay. That's okay.
And it's a big family. So, but on my side, my mother.
They worked hard and they played hard. Let's just say that.
They did. Yeah. They were hard workers. And that's where that was the last of them on that corner, which is now the corner of Obregon Park. Okay. And they raised the whole, all those families who lived there, all those houses were raised. The thing they kept on that corner of Mariana and First Street was the trees, eucalyptus tree. And it was very young when I first met when I used to go there. I used to go across the street to the building's still not there. It's now a church, but it was it was a CYO center, and it was called Santa Maria Center. And actually, that's how I really met my husband, because once we went to Belvedere, well, he was kind of popular because he was a big guy. He was an athlete, and he was known for all kinds of sports. Even he was sought after by Garfield, by Wilson, by Lincoln, and Roosevelt. What he did the week after he graduated from Belvedere, that was 1947, he went into the Army, like some of his buddies. There he became a boxer for the Army in the Pacific Theater, they call it. It was in wartime then, 40s. And he became the light heavyweight champion of that era. Wow. And then his career ended when they went on tour, and he got knocked out, and he said, okay, that's it.
Let's go.
And I was happy.
Let's go
Yeah,
make babies.
It wasn't something he loved, it's just something he did. Anyway, that's kind of jumping a lot of history.
No, that's fine. This is what we like to do here. Jump around. And so you start to create a family, you start to have, the children around you are young and wanting to do stuff. How did you end up connecting or finding your way to self-help graphics? And is that where you started making art, or were you already making?
I was making art, but in my own circle. at school, when I was at Hamel, I was the artist. I remember drawing a portrait of a classmate. She lived across the street. She was Chinese, and they were twins. It was Charlene and can't remember the other one, but she was in my class, and the teacher sat around the table, and we were doing art. And she didn't teach us art, but I had other teachers who taught art, and so I drew her, and and I even surprised myself. It was just, she said, it's observing and following the outlines. And I did that, and wow, and so she kept it, of course. But if she's sitting on a chair, and it's Charlene. In fact, I think I think the teacher gave it to her for her family, I think.
Oh, that's cute.
Anyway, I was always doing art, but my first remembrance of doing art in that adobe house, I got a nail and I incised a house with a tree and a smoke chimney and a flower in front of the house on the adobe wall. And
Hieroglyphics.
Yeah. In fact, we rented, and my mother at first said, "Ay, ¿qué le vamos a decir?" And then she said, "Okay, well, that was my." I lived with that in that house the rest of our stay there. And then, but my house was a hub for paisanos from Guanímaro. Most of the people that came over to Los Angeles, they worked in the fields in Torrance, in Dominguez Hills. All that was agricultural fields. And on Saturdays, they would come over with boxes of produce that they brought to us. And then they would make a bonfire and bake chicharros, but I don't know what they're in the pods, the green, and then also corn and other things. And they would gather around and talk about their tierra, their pueblo. And so I knew all these stories, and I was fascinated. And it was a dirt floor in that, just before the hill started to go up on San Carlos Street. And there was a big umbrella tree, and it would drop all these varitas, these twigs that were just straight, and it had a little berry that was dried. It was a seed. And so I liked to rake everything to get ready for Saturday that people were coming over. And I loved raking because I would make designs with a rake. And then I would it ended up being a project, and I would get all the varitas and make designs on the floor. And I always tell this story because I always come back to it. When I became a teacher, well, jumping that. But when I visited the Huntington Library with my students, we went into the Japanese garden, and then one section had designs had done with a rake, and I said, I used to do that when I was a little kid. And it's an art form, really. Everything that you do with line, and it's wonderful.
That's
and
what
then
they call a Zen garden, right?
Yes. And I used to do that with our yard. And it was away from the group, so I would just kind of watch it. And then when somebody stepped on it, the footprint, I mean, I would just, it was just part like a river flowing through. You just can't stop it. But then I would see how it created the designs over the lines, But I make designs with the lines. And then we used to do hopscotch on the dirt. We had a dirt sidewalk, of course. And I used to make these elaborate designs on the ones that become your square when you're tossing. They call it the lagger. And then so all of my squares had intricate designs, and I used to be proud of that. And then at school, but one of the things I started doing while I was still in elementary school, and then later at Belvedere, I used to save the wrappings for the meat. It was white butcher paper, and I would just, smooth them out. It was my paper, and usually it was pencil. I never did anything other than pencil until I got to junior high. And at Santa Maria Center, where we used to go to, they were social clubs, but when I was young, it was catechism, and so we had groups by grade or age groups. And then it was like a club. We'd go to Mass on Sundays and learn the catechism, but we also did the the director there, we did art one time, and I brought a drawing of the maguey in front of my house, and he said, "That's pretty." And I had done it on on school paper, lined paper. So he gave me a little pad and says, "Just do some more," and he gave me some tips about
That's nice.
shading. And so I was self-taught, but not entirely. I had mentors along the way, and not until Belvedere that I took an art class. In fact, I was in the same class as Roberto Chavez, who was a neighbor. He lived down the street on Mariana, and he's a famous artist now. He was cool. In fact, I was seventh grader. He was eighth grader, and he was really good artist, and so he was my classmate.
I'd like to say I'm self-taught as well, but then I say self-taught means that I was taught by my community,
Yeah, exactly.
not by the schools, but
Yeah.
by a community of like fellow photographers.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And
people like that.
so when I say self-taught, it's not entirely,
Yeah.
it's not literal, it's collectively, like
Yeah,
you say.
exactly.
And of course, learning, I did a lot of learning on my own by researching and looking, but I was influenced by other people, many. And I always say I was highly influenced by my mother, who never called herself an artist, but her creative spirit. She could make things.
There's a lot of people like that just have this magic to put
Yes.
things together and
And then even neighbors who could build something out of anything. I mean, it's resilience, resourcefulness, and empowerment. So I credit that background as beautiful. My background.
like the driving force, right?
Yes, exactly.
So you grew up around and you then had a family around and you live around the whole area right there where Brooklyn and Chavez is,
yes.
and there's self-help graphics.
Yes.
How did you walk in there one day? Did
Yes.
they used to pass out flyers back then?
I actually walked in, but before that, when they were still down the street of Brooklyn Abbey, I think it was 2011.
The first location.
Yeah, the first place. I was already teaching. I started teaching in 1975. I was
Were you teaching
at
art or?
no, I became a classroom teacher at City Terrace Elementary.
Oh, okay.
I mean, so it's still in the neighborhood. There's a big story in between because I went to East LA College after I had my 9 kids, and during like night classes, I took some of the basics,
Of art.
and but I have to backtrack before I answer the
That's okay.
question.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Well, once I got married, I just didn't do other things on my own. I would draw and do things, but I decided I always wanted to be an artist and a teacher. I knew I was an artist in my own way, but a teacher was something I always wanted to be. But I wanted to be a teacher in my neighborhood. That I thought of that by the time I was in junior high school. But so I went back to take night classes, and I first took the English and the basic classes, composition, writing, and then any art class that I could take. And it wasn't many because I didn't have a lot of time. But it was later when my children went to school. They went to Hamel Street School, and I started helping in the classroom, volunteering. And then in I can't remember, it must have been 1967, I already had my last child. She was, and they asked me, they hired me as they called it education aides. Now, today they're called TAs.
Teacher's aide,
Teacher's aides. But we were actually teacher's aides, the people there. All the children were Spanish speaking. Most of them were Spanish speaking, and those children the classroom I worked with, it was in the first grade. First I started in kindergarten, but the first grade. The children sat in the back. The teacher did not speak Spanish.
Wow.
The place where they participated fully was in math because they could do it. And so what the teacher started doing that first year that I was in that classroom, she said, "Well, can you can you talk to them? So I would try and duplicate the what she was teaching and teach them, but they didn't have materials. So sometimes we just made, I would write cards or something. And of course they weren't getting the full thing, but they were getting something. So then they started this bilingual program there. And it was patterned after, well, it wasn't a full program. What they started offered us the aides who were doing this, classes to help the teacher. And so it was interesting because it was a program from Dade County in Miami, because they had Cuban bilingual classrooms. And I remember the woman, the professor, she was from the University of Austin. In fact, because I had done so many visuals for the kids for me to help them, she asked me if I could illustrate some lessons, bilingual lessons, and I did for this curriculum. I mean, it wasn't big credit. I think I got credit on the page, but so I did some to go with a lesson on multicultural. It was how, while the kids were learning Christmas and Santa Claus, well, I did a few drawings, but I made the Santa Claus a Mexican Santa Claus. Anyway, we learned methodology, and so it was right up my alley. I wanted to be a teacher. But because of that, later on, by 1967, 1968, the school created a program called College Opportunity, and it was geared for teachers' aides who wanted to go into teaching. And of course, I got
that's
into
perfect.
that. And then, so I did that whole program with lots of other women, and many of the women had not finished high school, but they were working in the classroom. And I had finished high school, and I thought I was going to college right after that, but I only went a few months, and then I think 1 year, and then I got married. And I never went, I just didn't go back, so that was my dream. And that was so I count those years as a TA, as my teaching career, although not as a teacher, but I started as a teacher it's my only assignment my whole career. Well, I was 45 by the time I started teaching at City Terrace. And I had gone to school for a long time, taking one class here. But when that program came in, we had in order to be in it, you had to be a full-time student, and the minimum of 12 credits a semester. So I went to summer school, and I went to night school, and that's how I finished. So it took me a while to finish. Then I got a small scholarship from the Ford Foundation for when I wanted to transfer to Cal State LA. And I got a stipend for books. I think it was $200 a month. It was wonderful
but
for
it
me.
helps, yeah.
Books were affordable, more affordable then. And so I started teaching in 1975. I graduated in 1974, and then my teacher's credential extended to 1975. I was still doing that part. And all this time, my mother watched my kids. When I was at the school, at the elementary school, I would come home during my lunchtime and get, help my mom with getting things ready. My husband was a truck driver, and he did a lot of the cooking when I wasn't there. But my sons, my two older sons, my sons were already teenagers. My two oldest ones, they help with laundry. I mean, I could not have done it without my family.
Of course, and still to this day,
yes,
because they're all a part of it.
They're all involved. I say we grew up together.
Yeah. So to this day, you're still like making altars, having like Zoom calls and Zoom meetings and presentations across the United States, right? And maybe in other countries too. I don't know.
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
Well, and so once I started teaching, I learned about I don't know how I learned. Maybe it was the mobile, the
mobile art
group that came to City Terrace my first year, and I learned about self-graphics, Day of the Dead. And so a couple of teachers, we went to the site, and it wasn't during the workshops, but I met Sister Karen, and it was wonderful. And very soon after, they moved to Gage, Brooklyn and Gage, and that's 2 blocks from where I live today. I've been there since 1975. And so I think it must have been like 1979 when I first went there. And there was a sign in the window, and it said, it's the beautiful corner building. And it said, instructors needed for workshops for Day of the Dead. I was like, wow.
Aquí estoy.
So I walked in. In fact, no, not Patsy, but it is. That was another time. I went upstairs and met Sister Karen, and I said, I saw your sign. I would like to participate. I like to do art, and I didn't know what kind of art they wanted. And she said, do you know anything about Day of the Dead? I said, yeah, my mother. Okay. She didn't even let me finish. You come Saturday, and you'll give you some. We're busy, and you'll have something to do. And that was the beginning. And so the first year, I worked with Carlos Amezcua. Gee, my God, I can't. Yeah. And Michael, not Carlos, Michael Amezcua, and he was doing these headdresses with cardboard.
Wow.
And they were for the workshop. So I said, well, why don't you help Michael, because he's doing these big projects. And so I watched him, and I said, just cut out this cardboard, and then you're going to divide it and fold it in thirds. So I just watched him, and I folded and made a triangle, and that was the beginning. You could do anything you want with it. So I made these, and I have they're posted under Day of the Dead, under history. I made this Aztec. I cut out a space where it was for me to work, because that was the project.
So it was just like a presentation cardboard that folded like this?
Well, yeah, it was. They had big sheets of cardboard that they had acquired, and so we just folded them in thirds and made it like a triangle. And then I cut an opening, but I made designs at the top, like like fretted work, and added feathers and painted it orange with black, and that was the first year. and then with the students, we cut out cardboard pieces for them to make something that they could wear. So it was flat. It wasn't. And the reason I started with that, because Sister Karen says, all of the instructors, if you're making artifacts for the procession, they've got to be museum quality, because UCLA is interested in acquiring some of our pieces.
Wow.
And so, of course, Miss Mede, I would try it, and no edges showing. It was really a good piece, I thought. And
the pressure was good.
Yes, it was. The next year, I did another one that I saw in many of the photographs of years it was used afterwards, and that one was a piece that was flat, but I made a headpiece to hold it on, and ties, and it was like the embroidery from the Huicholes design. It was flowers. It was real pretty. It was blue, and that was worn. And I wore the Aztec one the first year, and the second year Rosana wore the one I had just made, and I wore this. I think I wore that one, and Rosana wore the one I had just made. Then I made others to be used for the processions, and Rosana and some of the directors wore some of them.
So what was the sentence or what was it that you were going to say to Sister Karen when she said, do you know about Day of the Dead?
Well, I was going to tell her.
Let's let you finish that sentence.
Yeah. Well, my mother always had 4 altars during the year. And one of them was Day of the Dead, but it wasn't elaborate or big. It was just a home altar. Actually, something she had all year long. And I think many families might have had that. And she always told stories about her Mama Pola and her. She didn't grow up with her mother, so she knew very little about her, just from her letters. But of her ancestors, the people she knew, and in those stories about remembering them, stories about the family, But I have to go back to my first experience that I remember with Day of the Dead. We have always, where I was born and where I still live is not far from Calvary Cemetery. You could walk there. And there was no celebration like today, like 40 years ago even. But my mother and my aunt would walk there, and they would take a lunch, and my cousins and I would go. We'd go walking, and she said, "Vamos a ir a decorar las lápidas." Decía, the headstones. Now, as far as I knew, we didn't have any close relatives there. We had my mother had paisanos from her village, because that's what brought us to East LA, that her father was there. He had a family of 10 children. That's another story. And my mother's other cousins from Juanimaro were in this neighborhood in Belvedere. And so the closest relatives were not buried there yet, but the remembrances were there. So my mother and my aunt went up there and we went to this grave site, and while my cousins and I went to play jumping the headstones, you could never step on them. That was terrible. That was really an admonishment. And then they would be working at this site, and then they'd call us, "Vénganse, vamos a comer," and they would have a spread of the lunch that they brought. No, never sandwiches. I didn't know sandwiches. And they had decorated this gravestone with flowers my mother brought from her, mostly heads of flowers. They had beheaded them. And then little pebbles or little stones. And then, I don't even remember the name of that. And she said, "Well, este fue el señor que le ayudó a mi papá a hacer la maceta." I mean, it was somebody from the village, but the connection was stories that they had with her family, with my Mama Pola, but then that led to the story of my grandfather, or her great grandfather, her grandfather, who was an alfarero, a pottery maker, and that there were still pots there in the village, and Mama Pola's little tract of land, and the man who had she had leased it to him to grow his little plot of corn. It was very small, but his harvest, he had to share it with her. So that's how she got her corn. And those stories, and
it
how I climbed up that mesquite when my Mama Pola ran after me, because I had watched her. She said she had watched her put something underneath on the floor, the dirt floor in her little house, and it was a brick. And so when she was alone, she went to look, and it was a little bag with 4 gold coins. And so my mother said, "Oh, the man at the store said he would give something for any gold coin." So she got one and took it, and she got stuff like candies and little prizes.
Of course.
And so when her mama learned this, and she said, "Well, I took it, but he gave me this." And she says, "Oh, don't you know what you did?
Christ,
This is my savings." Y quién sabe qué le diría. You said, "Malvada muchacha," and she was going to get the stick. My mother ran, and she ran up a mesquite tree, and she stayed up there. And the neighbor says, "Déjala que baje, Hipólita. Pero mira lo que me hizo, pues, ¿qué vas a hacer ahora?" And she said, so that story comes out in these stories around this, talking about Mama Pola was the one that I heard the most of. So that's why I say I knew her intimately just by my mother's stories.
So it was mostly like a gathering of just sharing, right? Sharing food and sharing stories and oral histories.
And that's why Day of the Dead for me was very prominent, although we didn't make any big celebration. We did go to church and, to the masses for the Holy Day of Obligation. But I never really connected it to this ritual.
I'm going to tell you my first Day of the Dead story just because you guys are your family is actually a part of it, even though you probably don't know this.
¿Qué pasó?
But my brother, I had a brother that died in 1993. And so I think it was probably 94 when I first walked into Self-Help Graphics and was like, it was a Day of the Dead thing. And I was like, wow, this. I don't remember how I got there or who I went with, but I remember seeing all the altars and just being like, really moved and I was like, I'm gonna come back and I'm gonna put some pictures of my brother and my grandma here. I didn't know that they were art pieces, So I actually came back another time and I put pictures of my brother and my grandma and the grandfather. I put 3 pictures up. And then I came back a couple weeks later and I was like, oh, I'm here to pick up the pictures or whatever. They're like, everything was already taken down.
Oh.
And so I said, oh, well, how can I get those pictures? And they asked me to call the Esparza family. So I called somebody. I'm not sure who I spoke with. But I never actually went to get them. They said, we didn't see any pictures that weren't, or I don't know, whatever happened, like the pictures ended up living with the whatever, whatever got taken down.
Well, when people have left, we just take them with us.
Yeah, that's fine.
And I didn't. They're part of the next year's altar.
And that first Day of the Dead too. When I did the procession, the first time I did it with my daughter. That was a few years later. The first time I did the procession, it was very minimal, somber, and it was just from the Cinco Puntos to Self-Help Graphics, where the location there was a small procession.
I wonder, they had probably already, Sister Karen died in 1997, and
it was probably around that time.
Yeah, and it kind of stopped that. I don't know if they had already stopped there was some. I don't know when that procession stopped, and so they were just going from the corner here, and to keep up that tradition. And I think it had to do with a county or the safety or something. But the first years, that was where the destination in the cemetery.
Oh, really?
That's
at Calvary?
No, at Evergreen.
Oh, Evergreen. Oh, so you went from the cemetery to Self-Help Graphics.
Oh, well, because we walked all the way everybody walked to the cemetery. And
I
then
never did that
there
one,
was ceremony and, and then everybody walked back to Self-Help Graphics to the parking lot and all the other activities that were going on there. And it was more like a formal procession because it was, people walked to the cemetery to do the event and then processed back to Self-Help Graphics.
So we're going to have to just move forward because I want to get to the point where somehow, some way, you connected with Disney and, became part of the consulting team, right?
Okay. Well, we were advisors.
Advisors.
Yeah,
okay.
Because it isn't a pay.
Yeah.
But it was interesting.
What was your experience with them? And were they a bunch of jerks or should we treat them kindly?
Because she had actual contact with the director and a couple of the screenwriter when we got there. But of course, the background of that was the infamous Disney
wanting to copyright the name Day of the Dead,
which and of course it was ridiculous. huge backlash and letters, and I was one of those people. Many people, know, and in within hours, Rosana knows more exact. They had to withdraw that statement, and I don't know if they said something or rescinded anyway. And so that was the angst with Disney, and then. We got a call, I think it was from Lalo Alcaraz, that they submitted our name, I believe that's how it went, to be part of this cadre of Chicanos, artists of different walks. We were the only altar makers for a talk about the new movie they were talking about. And so when we got a letter to invite us to Pixar, we were part of a group, I would say. And they went in two groups. I think our group was like 10 or 11 people, and the other group had gone before us. So it was a total of about 20 people. And what they wanted to do was to get input and feedback and maybe authentication, I'm not sure, but I'm sure that was part of it, from the community, because they didn't want to go through that, that thing they had gone before. And this time they had one of the, I think he was a screenwriter then, with a lot of input was from Mexico, Molina, Adrian Molina, and but his roots were in Mexico. So what they had done, they had gone to Mexico and visited with his family, stayed in Michoacan, and they visited Oaxaca. I call those the cradles of the celebration of Dia de Muertos. It's all over Mexico, but those are the so well known. And they actually, lived there and experienced all the activity leading to Day of the Dead and all the, and so they were ready to do this film and the story. And what they did when we got there, Rosanna, well, they greeted us really nice. In fact, we were picked up in a limousine from the from the plane to take us to the Pixar's little loft, and it's near Berkeley. And Rosanna, I saw her talking to, so I had walked ahead because I had seen a couple of people I knew. And then they came up and they greeted us. And Rosanna says they were so happy to see you because what they told me is, I hope you like the bridge. And that's one thing that I remember her telling me. And so when we got there, we were put in a screen room and we saw the whole film. Oh, they took us through the animation department and the actual artist who was doing the character, who had done the character of Miguel, is it the little boy and the abuela, Coco. Yeah. So his father. So those were developed already, but they showed us the process. It's amazing, artists, to make them move and all that. And then we went into the theater to watch the film they had done up to then. And in the theater they used the drawings, and the rest were still in process. I don't remember. They used a lot of drawings as the characters, but the dialogue, everything was already being shown to us, and it was really good. I mean, it was so beautiful, and then we went. They took us into a conference room, a big table, and then we want your feedback, your opinions, your suggestions, or what you didn't like, So they listened. Most of them all of them, I would say, had some positive. I liked it. One of the things that, I don't know who said it, but they said, I do have a problem with one thing, because in the story they make shoes and they have leather. He says they do leather, and when the grandmother, she threw a cuchara at him, and everybody says, you don't throw cucharas.
You throw a chancla.
You throw a chancla. And we all laughed. They changed that.
That's hilarious.
Yeah. And then some of the just little bits, and I said, because they alluded to the 3 deaths that I always talk about, and they didn't say anything about the second death. The second death is when you're buried. And he said, well.
So it's when you first pass away, right?
Yes. And well, the first death is the day that you give your last breath. The day that you actually die.
So then it's when you get buried.
And I always say it the way my mother said it. Para nunca vertes, jamás vernos sobre la tierra, never to be seen on the earth again. Yeah. And then the third, of course, the most dreaded and worst death is to be forgotten. So they talked about the first death and the.
And your mom taught you these.
Yeah, she's the one who first told me that. It was so profound. And at her funeral, the priest said that. My mother had mentioned that a long time ago, but it wasn't. I don't know. It wasn't as profoundly, but when it was at her funeral, it just hit me. And I always quote that. And I credit my mother, and I don't know if I've mentioned that the priest said that, but he was really on target as far as a Chicano. He was unique to me. Anyway, that's something I've always told, and I always say that's the essence of the work that I do, because it was so important for my mother to remember, especially her Mama Pola. And I got to meet my grandfather. He died 1985, 5 or 6. I knew him since I was a child because he lived in L.A. Before my mother was left in Guanimara with her mama Pola, first by her mother when my mother was an infant, so she didn't really remember her mother, but she used to write to her mother. Her mother wrote to her. She came to the U.S. and took her brother with her. So my mother didn't grow up with her only blood brother. And she was left with Mama Pola and my grandfather. But in 1910, my grandfather was taken by the Federals to fight in the Revolutionary War. And she never saw him until she came to Los Angeles, years later. Yeah. But she had contact with him. He always wrote that was his town. But in all those years, when she last saw him when he got to Los Angeles, he had met another woman, and they had 10 children. So when my mother came to Los Angeles, she had 10 half brothers and brother and sisters, and so those connections were there for us before we got there. So that's why my mother and my aunts kept up their traditions. My brother says, se vino pero se trajo su tierra, and she did all her customs.
That's beautiful. Se vino pero se trajo su tierra. Yeah.
And so, I thought I lived in Mexico when I was a little kid because everybody, all our customs, our first language was Spanish,
and you were on Mexican land. So.
Yes. I didn't know it then, but we were on our own lands.
So, all of these stories that you're bringing up, I think each could be completely broken down and learn more and more about. But unfortunately, we only have an hour here to talk.
That's why I said I could talk a lot.
No, that's fine. I mean, I appreciate the stories, and I'm sure people appreciate just listening to you and you sharing so much about your life with us is always beautiful. I did reach out to one person just to send me a question. I said, send me a question of something that you would like to ask Ofelia, and this is from Yvonne Gallardo. She said, first, I have so much love and admiration for you, Ofelia. Thank you for all that you have done and continue to do for nuestra cultura. Two-part question. What is your favorite memory as a child? And 2, because you have done so much for others and because I want to be a good leader, a good elder, what do you do as a form of self-care? So I guess let's go with the first one.
Okay.
What was your favorite memory as a child?
I kind of have said several. I have so many. I think that it's hard to pick one. One is very powerful.
There's no wrong answers.
Okay. Well, one of the things as a later child, I was about 7. I don't think I was 8 yet. My brother always worked hard to take us to the show, and he bought his first bike with shining shoes, and Salas, a corner druggist who everybody knew in the neighborhood. And one day, my sister and I were we called it the plunge. Some people laugh.
The swimming pool, yeah.
It was Atlantic Plunge there in East LA. And my sister and I were playing. We didn't swim, so we were in the lowest level of water. My brother was he was climbing up the ladder for the diving board, the high diving board. And so my sister and I were splashing water with each other, and we splashed some 2 boys that were playing there. They were a little older. And then they started splashing us back, so they're playing with us, but actually they got mad. But then they started splashing, violently.
Aggressively, yeah.
And so then he said, "Stop it, you black commando." But he said it in a way that his face, and it hurt my heart. My nickname, my term of endearment at home was negra. I was really dark skinned, especially in the summer. And I started to cry. And then my brother, I guess he was always watching us from up wherever he was. He came, I saw him, and I'm looking for him. I see him running across. In fact, they called him, "Don't run." And he got to us. "¿Qué te pasa? What's wrong?" He said, then I'm crying. I'm saying, me dijo que era negra commando, no sé. And he stopped and went like this, "Cállate, be quiet." He says, don't you ever be ashamed of your color. If you don't stop crying, I'm going to slap you. And I got so, I couldn't understand. He says, ¿que no sabes que nuestra sangre corre, que en nuestras venas corre sangre de reyes? And he had heard that from my mother, because years later, more recently, Rosana was quoting that my mother had told her that. So he got that from my mother. She got it from Mama Pola, I'm sure.
Oral histories, it's important.
and it's,
that's beautiful.
It has stayed with me all my life. And that's one of the things, not in those words, but in lots of ways. When I was teaching, I had all Spanish-speaking students, mostly Mexican, from Mexico. And I always try to inculcate that. You're strong, you have so much to offer. Look, honor your mother and your father, find out where they're from. Because as I was growing up, of course, we were demeaned and hit for speaking Spanish. You know, that it was ingrained racism, and everybody did it. Openly. And then I see it again in the last, 5, 6 years. So it's important to remember that. We have so much to offer. We come from such beautiful, magnificent heritage.
Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful.
I could
that's okay. So the second question now, and this is actually a good thing to talk about now, is like, how do you do self-care for yourself? What are the things that you do to, feel good, to have a better...
Oh, gosh.
You're familiar with the term self-care.
Yes,
sure,
of course.
Popular.
First of all, I owe it to my beginnings. I never ate processed food till I was maybe 14. My mother grew her own food, and
my mom came from Mexico, and when I was young too, none of us had processed food. We never ate at restaurants. We maybe pancakes was like the only thing that was processed. But yeah, everything was like homemade with natural things.
That's such a foundation, and I mean, I of course I swerved off of that beginning many years ago.
Me too.
But I have to be reminded by my children, especially my daughters, who live right next to me. But I think eating right, and not only eating right, but I think your spirit of knowing your own spirit, your own goals, or achieving, working towards your goals. But I think just having this support of love around me, and loving where I live, and my art. That, not just my art, but the creative spirit. And I've told this to women that, ask me for some kind of counseling. You have to nurture your creative spirit, because that's who you are. And whenever you do anything, whether it's any hand thing or composition you write, it's your own creativity, that it's new ground. You're always testing new ground. And what does that do for your spirit, for your self-worth, it nurtures our soul, not only our soul, but our health, our brain, to know that you contribute something, if not to others, but to yourself. And you're the most important person to take care of. And of course, that spreads out to others, to people that we love and who live around us, our family. But I think not always having a purpose, knowing that you have a purpose. Again, it's self-esteem. Not that I always had it. I was always very quiet and timid in a way. My mother was a monster image mountain woman, and I learned from her. Her spirit was strong. She could do almost everything. And then in school, I always had to compete with my Jewish and white friends. I was always in those classes with them, and I had to really muster up energy and to speak up. And I always had answers, but I said, what if I don't say it right? And I would, and sometimes the teacher would say, "Oh," like surprised that I could think and talk, But so I had to buoy myself up to really express what I was thinking, and I always tried to do well in school. I was a good student, and so that self-esteem, but it comes from the people around you and your place in your family, that you're important, and people are, it's reciprocal. When you're important, people around you who love you or feel that, you exchange that energy and that mindset. And I think that's it. I'm a spiritual woman, and I do feel, yes, I belong to a religion, but I also believe in the natural world, the original indigenous teachings that we get from nature, from the cosmos, from things beyond what we understand. And it's not always
beyond our understanding or control.
And it's endless. That's infinity.
Yes.
And there's so much more to, I think also always wanting to learn more. I always say I learn from others.
That.
All my
Constantly
children,
learning.
my students and people, I learn from them. I listen to them, and wow, they inspire me. It's so much to do and learn.
I tell my friends that are young that haven't had children that, like, when you do have a child, well, that's what happened to me. Like, when I first had my child, and you relearn the entire world again, and it's funny because you relearn the simplest things, and you kind of forget how it felt to learn that. And anyways, to continue to learn is continuing to learn always is something that I also like try to work. And
I also sometimes someone asked me, "Where's your philosophy? Where did you read?" And I said, the people whose philosophy and have influenced me never wrote a book. My mother, my neighbors.
That's beautiful.
The children, the animals, the plants. I mean, it's so much in our universe around us. It's right there, and we have it in us.
Okay, Ofelia. We end this podcast every week with a simple question, and it's a question that I always ask the guests to try to answer in one sentence. But you can answer any way you want, but we'd like to have the answers in one sentence if you can. And all of the things that you do, your magic, you create, you write, you create this community, you create this energy, you share with us all these things, and the question is, how do you do it?
Oh my God. That's a good question. Sometimes I ask myself, but I don't answer it, but I think it's a drive within you to, I think it's based on love. Love, my children have such wisdom. I learn from them. And I think just life around me is so important. Even though I tell people I can't do it in one sentence.
Of course, that's fine.
Life around us is so important, and we get energy from all life around us, especially our family, the people but you have to give it back. I think that's what it is, and you get energized, and I feel it's something I have to do.
You have to keep the ebb and flow going.
Learning.
Well, thank you so much for honoring us with your presence here today. And quick note on this shirt.
I love
Ofelia and I put this shirt together once at a Dewey Tafoya screen printing shop at Self Help Graphics. I drew the flowers, and Ofelia drew the hummingbird. And then we were both working separate when Dewey said, "Oh, you should put the hummingbird on top of the flowers."
Yeah, that was cool.
And so
it's beautiful that it stands out.
It still worked out.
And the hummingbird is my animal spirit. I've always said that.
With that said, thank you so much. Look up Ofelia Esparza online. Just Google her, and you'll find a lot of stuff, especially on your national recognition, and a lot of articles. And thank you very much, and we'll see you guys next week.